behind the grand gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition meet modern crisis management. A single moment can shift the balance of power forever. When royal protocol clashes with family loyalty, and when emergency meetings happen behind closed doors while the world watches, even the most trusted guardians must choose sides. In the marble corridors where whispers carry more weight than proclamations, a silent confrontation unfolds that will test the very foundations of the monarchy. This is not just another day in the palace. This is the day when duty, love, and power collide in ways that will echo through royal history. What happens when those sworn to protect must decide who truly deserves their loyalty? The answer lies in a standoff so quiet, yet so powerful, that it changes everything without a single word being spoken. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine gardens of Buckingham Palace as Margaret Thornton adjusted her crisp white gloves for the third time that hour. As the Queen Consort's personal security detail coordinator, she had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when the day would be anything but ordinary. The unusual flurry of early morning phone calls, the hushed conversations between senior staff members, and the way Camilla's private secretary kept glancing nervously at her watch all pointed to something significant brewing beneath the surface of royal routine. Margaret had been serving the royal family for over 15 years, starting as a junior protection officer and working her way up through dedication, discretion, and an almost supernatural ability to anticipate trouble before it manifested. She understood the delicate ecosystem of palace life, where every gesture carried meaning and silence often spoke louder than words. Today, however, something felt different. The air itself seemed charged with an energy that made her instincts sharpen and her attention focus with laser precision. Camilla emerged from her private quarters at precisely 8:30, as she had every morning for the past 2 years. Her appearance was impeccable as always, but Margaret noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed almost imperceptibly against her handbag, and the forced brightness in her smile as she greeted the morning staff. These were the tells that came with experience in reading people whose lives were lived under constant scrutiny. The Queen Consort schedule for the day appeared routine on paper. A morning review of correspondence, a brief meeting with the head groundskeeper about the upcoming garden party preparations, and lunch with representatives from one of her patronage organizations. Nothing that should have caused the undercurrent of nervous energy that Margaret could feel pulsing through the palace corridors like an invisible current. As they made their way through the familiar route toward the morning room, Margaret's earpiece crackled with a message that made her pause mid-step. William's security team was requesting immediate coordination for an unscheduled meeting. The Prince of Wales rarely called emergency gatherings without significant advance notice, and the urgency in the coded language used by his protection officers suggested this was no ordinary royal consultation. Margaret's training kicked in automatically. She began running through contingency protocols, assessing potential security implications, and calculating the safest routes through the palace should rapid movement become necessary. But beneath her professional composure, questions began forming that she couldn't yet answer. Why hadn't Camilla been informed of William's urgent meeting? Why was her schedule being maintained as if nothing unusual was happening? And why did she have the distinct feeling that these two events were connected in ways that would soon become problematic? The palace's internal communication system was typically flawless, with information flowing seamlessly between departments to ensure that all senior royals were kept informed of developments that might affect them. The fact that this system seemed to have developed a gap this morning was more concerning than any direct threat Margaret had ever faced. In her experience, communication breakdowns in royal households were never accidental. Camilla settled into her morning routine with practiced grace, but Margaret noticed how her eyes kept drifting toward the windows that faced the section of the palace where William maintained his offices. There was something expectant in her posture, as if she was waiting for news that hadn't yet arrived. Margaret had seen this behavior before, usually preceding moments when the carefully orchestrated world of royal protocol was about to encounter an unexpected disruption. The morning correspondence review proceeded normally, with Camilla responding to letters from well-wishers, reviewing invitations to future events, and approving statements prepared by her communications team. But Margaret observed how her attention seemed divided, how she would pause between documents to listen to sound from the corridors, and how her responses became increasingly brief as the hour progressed. At 10:15, Margaret received another message through her earpiece. William's meeting had officially commenced, and the guest list was being classified at the highest levels of palace security. This was unprecedented. Emergency meetings were one thing, but classified attendee lists suggested issues that went far beyond routine royal business. Margaret's concern deepened as she realized that whatever was happening in that meeting room would likely have implications that extended throughout the entire royal household. Camilla seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere without needing explicit information. Her years of experience in navigating the complex dynamics of royal life had given her an intuitive understanding of when the normal rhythms of palace existence were being disrupted. She began asking subtle questions about the day's schedule, wondering aloud if any adjustments might be necessary, and suggesting flexibility that Margaret recognized as preparation for unexpected developments. The Queen Consort's protection protocols were designed to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining her safety and dignity. Margaret began implementing preliminary precautionary measures, quietly alerting her team to prepare for potential schedule modifications and ensuring that secure communication channels remained open. She had learned through experience that being prepared for uncertainty was more valuable than trying to predict specific outcomes. As the morning progressed, Margaret noticed increasing activity in the corridors that connected to William's section of the palace. Senior staff members moved with purpose, carrying sealed envelopes and speaking in hushed tones that suggested confidential business. The palace's normally transparent internal environment was developing pockets of opacity that made Margaret's professional instincts increasingly alert. Camilla completed her correspondence review and moved toward her meeting with the head groundskeeper, but Margaret could see that her mind was elsewhere. The Queen Consort possessed a remarkable ability to maintain her public composure while processing complex emotional or political situations. But today that ability was being tested in ways that suggested the stakes were higher than usual. The groundskeeper meeting proceeded smoothly, with discussions about flower arrangements, lawn maintenance, and preparation timelines for the upcoming garden party. But Margaret noticed how Camilla's responses, while perfectly appropriate, lacked her usual personal engagement with details that normally fascinated her. She was present in body, but clearly preoccupied with matters that remained unspoken. During a brief break between appointments, Margaret approached Camilla with the careful deference that marked their professional relationship. She inquired whether any adjustments to the day's schedule might be advisable, given the increased activity throughout the palace. Camilla's response was measured and thoughtful, acknowledging that flexibility might indeed prove valuable, while maintaining her intention to fulfill her scheduled commitments unless circumstances absolutely required otherwise. This response told Margaret everything she needed to know about Camilla's awareness of the situation. The Queen Consort understood that something significant was developing, but she was choosing to maintain her normal routine as a form of dignified resistance to being excluded from whatever decisions were being made elsewhere in the palace. It was a strategy that demonstrated both strength and vulnerability, and Margaret respected the courage it required. As the morning moved toward its conclusion, Margaret received intelligence that William's meeting was expanding rather than concluding. Additional security personnel were being deployed, and communication restrictions were being implemented that suggested the sensitivity of the discussions had escalated beyond initial expectations. Margaret realized that whatever was happening in that classified meeting would soon require decisions about how to manage its impact on the rest of the royal household, including Camilla. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test the boundaries of royal protocol, family loyalty, and personal dignity. Margaret could feel the tension building like atmospheric pressure before a storm, and she knew that her role in the coming hours would require every skill she had developed in her years of royal service. The morning that had started with routine efficiency was transforming into something that would demand extraordinary measures to navigate successfully. The palace corridors seemed to whisper with anticipation as the various forces set in motion by the morning's events began to converge toward an inevitable moment of confrontation. Margaret prepared herself for whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that in the world of royal service, the most significant battles were often fought in silence, with dignity and duty as the only weapons available. The ornate double doors of the Wales conference room had remained sealed for 3 hours, with only the occasional emergence of senior advisors carrying encrypted tablets and wearing expressions that revealed nothing to the trained observers stationed throughout the corridor. Inside, Prince William sat at the head of an oval table that had witnessed countless royal decisions over the decades, his usually composed demeanor showing subtle signs of the weight he carried in these unprecedented circumstances. The meeting had begun with William's private secretary reading a classified briefing that outlined security concerns that had emerged overnight. Intelligence services had identified potential threats to the monarchy's public standing, not from external enemies, but from internal communications that had been intercepted and analyzed. The implications were staggering, and the need for immediate, decisive action was clear to everyone present except for those who remained unaware of the gathering itself. Sir David Hartwell, the Queen's former private secretary who now served as an advisor on constitutional matters, adjusted his spectacles as he reviewed documents that detailed a complex web of relationships and communications that threatened to undermine the careful balance William had been working to establish since assuming his expanded role following his father's coronation. The situation required delicate handling that would protect the institution while addressing legitimate concerns about loyalty and trust within the royal household. William's security chief, Colonel James Whitmore, provided updates on the practical implications of the intelligence they had received. Communications had been monitored, travel patterns analyzed, and financial records reviewed in ways that painted a picture of activities that, while not illegal, raised serious questions about discretion and judgment. The colonel's military bearing remained impeccable, but William could see the concern in his eyes as he outlined the potential consequences of inaction. The Prince of Wales understood that the decisions made in this room would reverberate throughout the monarchy for years to come. He had inherited not just titles and responsibilities, but the complex legacy of family dynamics that had played out in public view for generations. Today's crisis was both deeply personal and profoundly institutional, requiring him to balance his roles as family member and future king in ways that previous generations had never faced. Lady Catherine Morrison, the constitutional expert who had advised the royal family through several previous crises, presented options for addressing the situation with varying degrees of severity and publicity. Each approach carried risks and benefits that needed to be weighed against the long-term stability of the crown. Her decades of experience had taught her that royal crises often required solutions that prioritized institutional survival over individual comfort. The evidence laid out across the conference table told a story of gradual erosion of boundaries that should have remained inviolate. Private conversations have been shared inappropriately, confidential information had been discussed with unauthorized parties, and relationships had developed that created conflicts of interest within the royal household. None of these activities constituted betrayal in a legal sense, but collectively they represented a pattern that could not be ignored. William reviewed transcripts of conversations that had been recorded through routine security monitoring, each one adding another piece to a puzzle that revealed poor judgment rather than malicious intent. The context made the situation more complex rather than simpler, as it required addressing behavior that was problematic without being criminal, disappointing without being treacherous. The prince's legal advisor, Sir Marcus Pemberton, explained the constitutional precedents for dealing with situations where family members created complications for the monarchy through their associations and communications. History provided examples of solutions ranging from gentle guidance to formal exclusion, but each historical case had occurred in different circumstances that made direct comparison difficult. As the meeting progressed, William found himself facing the realization that protecting the institution he was destined to lead might require making decisions that would cause personal pain to people he cared about. This was the burden of leadership that his grandmother had carried with such dignity, and his father continued to bear with quiet strength. Now, it was his turn to choose between competing loyalties in service of a greater good. The intelligence briefing continued with details about how the monitored activities had begun innocuously, but had gradually expanded into territory that raised legitimate security concerns. Phone calls had been made to individuals whose own associations were questionable. Information had been shared that should have remained within the family, and judgments had been made that demonstrated a concerning lack of awareness about the implications of royal connections. Colonel Whitmore outlined the security protocols that would need to be implemented to contain the situation while preserving the dignity of all parties involved. His recommendations included communication monitoring, movement restrictions, and access limitations that would effectively create isolation within the royal household. These measures were designed to protect rather than punish, but William understood that the distinction might not be apparent to those affected. The Prince of Wales asked pointed questions about alternatives to the recommended course of action, exploring whether education and counseling might achieve the necessary changes without implementing more restrictive measures. His advisors acknowledged these possibilities, but explained why previous attempts at gentle correction had failed to produce the behavioral changes needed to address the security concerns adequately. Sir David provided historical context for royal decisions that had prioritized institutional protection over individual preferences, explaining how these choices had strengthened rather than weakened the monarchy over time. The examples were sobering reminders that effective royal leadership sometimes required making decisions that caused short-term distress in service of long-term stability. Lady Morrison presented polling data that showed public opinion about royal family dynamics remained fragile following previous controversies, making it essential that any new issues be addressed swiftly and decisively. The monarchy's approval ratings had recovered from earlier challenges, but this recovery depended on maintaining public confidence in the family's judgment and unity. William reviewed financial records that showed concerning patterns of expenditure and association that, while legal, created appearances that could be exploited by critics of the monarchy. The amounts involved were not substantial by royal standards, but the purposes and recipients raised questions about judgment and discretion that could not be ignored. The Prince's communications director briefed the group on media intelligence, suggesting that journalists were beginning to investigate aspects of royal household operations that had previously remained private. This external pressure created urgency around addressing internal issues before they became public scandals that would be much more difficult to manage. As the afternoon progressed, William wrestled with the knowledge that the person at the center of these concerns was someone who had become family, someone who had worked to find their place within the complex world of royal life. The evidence suggested poor judgment rather than malicious intent, but the potential consequences of continued poor judgment made action necessary regardless of personal feelings. The meeting's tone shifted as William moved from information gathering to decision-making. His advisors presented their final recommendations with the understanding that the prince would bear ultimate responsibility for the consequences of whatever course of action was chosen. The weight of this responsibility was visible in his posture as he considered options that would affect not just the individuals directly involved, but the entire royal family. Colonel Whitmore outlined the practical steps that would need to be taken immediately to implement whatever decisions were made, including personnel assignments, communication protocols, and security measures that would take effect within hours. The efficiency of royal administration meant that once decisions were made, they would be implemented with precision and speed that left little room for reconsideration. William understood that the measures being discussed would create a new reality within the royal household, one that would test relationships and loyalties in ways that had not been anticipated when the family had expanded to include new members. The personal cost of institutional protection was becoming clear, and he knew that the coming hours would reveal whether the bonds of family could survive the requirements of duty. The Prince of Wales prepared to make decisions that would define his leadership style, and set precedents for how he would handle future crises as king. The lessons of this moment would shape his approach to balancing personal relationships with institutional responsibilities for the rest of his reign. As the meeting moved toward its conclusion, William knew that the most difficult part of the day still lay ahead. The grandfather clock in the main corridor chimed 2 o'clock as Camilla finished her lunch meeting with remarkable composure, despite the growing awareness that something significant was being deliberately kept from her. Throughout the elegant meal with representatives from the Children's Literacy Foundation, she had maintained perfect royal protocol while processing the subtle signs that her world was shifting in ways she could not yet fully understand. Margaret Thornton observed the Queen Consort's masterful performance of normalcy with professional admiration and personal concern. She had received 3 encrypted messages during the lunch hour, each one adding layers of complexity to the situation developing elsewhere in the palace. The final message had been the most direct: implement containment protocols immediately following the conclusion of current engagements. Margaret understood the implications, even as she hoped she was wrong about what they meant. As Camilla bid farewell to her guests with warmth that seemed entirely genuine despite the circumstances, Margaret noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted her pearls. It was a tell that appeared only when the Queen Consort was processing information that challenged her understanding of her position within the royal hierarchy. Today, that understanding was about to be tested in ways that would require every ounce of dignity and strength she possessed. The walk back through the palace corridors felt different than it had that morning. The usual bustle of staff activity continued, but Margaret detected an undercurrent of tension that suggested news of the emergency meeting had begun to filter through the household. Servants moved with slightly more purpose. Conversations ended more quickly when Camilla approached, and the normal rhythms of palace life showed subtle alterations that spoke of impending change. Camilla paused outside the portrait gallery, ostensibly to admire a recently cleaned painting of Queen Victoria, but Margaret recognized the moment as an opportunity for the Queen Consort to gather her thoughts before whatever came next. In the reflection of the glass protecting the portrait, Margaret could see Camilla's face processing calculations about timing, protocol, and possibilities that her years of experience had taught her to consider. The Queen Consort's afternoon schedule included a review of patronage applications and preparation for the following week's engagements, activities that would normally take place in her private office suite. However, as they approached the familiar corridors leading to that section of the palace, Margaret received a message that made her pause mid-step and request a brief private consultation with Her Majesty. In the discreet alcove beside the Queen's gallery, Margaret delivered the news that would transform the remainder of the day. Security protocols required that Camilla's access to certain areas of the palace be temporarily restricted, while sensitive discussions continued in other locations. The language was diplomatic, and the reasoning was presented as precautionary, but both women understood the reality beneath the careful phrasing. Camilla's response revealed the steel beneath her public warmth. She asked precise questions about the nature of the discussions, the duration of the restrictions, and the authority under which these measures were being implemented. Margaret provided what information she could while respecting the classification levels that bound her responses. The exchange was professional and courteous, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. The Queen Consort requested to speak directly with William about these developments, a reasonable request that Margaret had anticipated and dreaded in equal measure. The response she had to provide was perhaps the most difficult of her career. His Royal Highness was not available for consultation at this time, and communications were being directed through official channels only. The implications of this restriction hit both women simultaneously. Rather than express anger or demand explanations that Margaret could not provide, Camilla made a decision that demonstrated both her understanding of royal protocol and her determination to maintain dignity under pressure. She would continue with her scheduled activities while requesting that all developments be communicated to her through appropriate channels. It was a response that showed strength, wisdom, and a subtle form of resistance to being marginalized. Margaret implemented the modified security arrangements with professional efficiency while feeling personal distress about their necessity. Additional personnel were discreetly positioned throughout the Queen Consort's usual areas of movement. Communication protocols were adjusted to route through central security rather than direct channels, and access codes were temporarily modified to restrict movement to predetermined areas. The afternoon patronage review proceeded in Camilla's private sitting room, with her secretary presenting applications from organizations seeking royal association and support. The Queen Consort's responses showed her usual careful consideration of each request, but Margaret noticed how her attention occasionally drifted towards sounds from other parts of the palace, as if she was monitoring activities from which she was now excluded. As the hours passed, the isolation created by the security protocols became more apparent. Phone calls that would normally be put through immediately were being screened and delayed. Staff members who usually moved freely between different sections of the palace were being redirected through alternative routes. The efficient communication network that typically kept all senior royals informed was developing deliberate gaps that excluded Camilla from information she would normally receive. The Queen Consort adapted to these changes with remarkable grace, but Margaret could see the emotional cost in subtle ways. Camilla's conversation became more measured, her movements more controlled, and her smiles more carefully constructed. She was drawing upon reserves of strength built through years of navigating complex personal and public challenges, but the current situation was testing those reserves in new ways. Around 4 o'clock, Margaret received confirmation that William's meeting had concluded and that implementation of final decisions would begin immediately. The Prince of Wales would be personally overseeing the next phase of operations, which meant that direct communication between family members would remain restricted until new protocols could be established. Margaret realized that the silent confrontation developing between duty and family loyalty was about to become more explicit. Camilla seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere without needing specific information. Her preparation for the following week's engagements became more focused and detailed, as if she was creating structure and purpose to counteract the uncertainty surrounding her immediate circumstances. Margaret recognized this behavior as a coping mechanism that demonstrated resilience rather than denial. The Queen Consort asked thoughtful questions about security arrangements for her upcoming public appearances, showing particular interest in coordination protocols and communication procedures. Margaret understood that these inquiries were really about understanding how extensively her role might be affected by whatever decisions were being implemented. The answers she provided were carefully calibrated to be reassuring while remaining truthful about ongoing uncertainties. As afternoon moved toward evening, the palace corridors took on a different quality. The usual pre-dinner preparations were proceeding, but with modifications that reflected the new reality of divided household operations. Staff members moved with additional purposefulness, and conversations were briefer and more focused than usual. The normal social rhythms of royal family life were being disrupted in ways that everyone could feel, but few could openly acknowledge. Margaret prepared for what she suspected would be the day's most challenging moment. The period when family members would normally gather for drinks before dinner, a routine that had become an important part of maintaining relationships within the royal household. Tonight, that routine would be impossible to maintain, and the reasons for its absence would speak louder than any official explanations. Camilla completed her afternoon work with characteristic thoroughness, approving final details for charity visits, reviewing speeches prepared by her communications team, and signing correspondence that would go out under the royal seal. Each task was completed with attention to detail that suggested determination to maintain standards regardless of personal circumstances. The Queen Consort's dignity throughout the afternoon had been remarkable, but Margaret could see signs of strain in small details. The way she held her shoulders slightly higher than usual, how she paused fractionally longer before responding to questions, and the carefully controlled way she moved through spaces that had become subtly foreign despite their familiarity. As the day moved toward its conclusion, Margaret realized that the silent confrontation between institutional requirements and family relationships had created a new dynamic within the royal household. The decisions made in William's emergency meeting were being implemented with precision and efficiency, but their human cost was becoming apparent in the spaces between words, the gaps in communication, and the careful distances being maintained between people who had previously operated as an integrated family unit. The evening would bring new challenges as the reality of the changed circumstances became impossible to ignore. Margaret prepared herself for managing a situation that had no clear precedents and no obvious solutions, knowing that her role in protecting Camilla's dignity would become even more crucial as the implications of the day's events became fully apparent. The evening shadows stretched across the palace gardens as Margaret Thornton faced the most defining moment of her 15-year career in royal protection. Standing in the corridor outside Camilla's private quarters, she had just received orders that would require her to choose between following institutional directives and protecting the dignity of the person she had sworn to serve. The choice would define not only her future, but the nature of loyalty itself within the royal household. The directive had been clear and unambiguous. Prevent the Queen Consort from attending the family dinner that evening, using whatever means necessary to ensure compliance without creating a public incident. The reasoning provided was that sensitive discussions would continue during the meal, and security protocols required the exclusion of individuals not cleared for participation in ongoing classified matters. Margaret understood the logic, but she also understood what this would mean to Camilla personally. Camilla had spent the late afternoon preparing for the evening with meticulous care that spoke of determination to maintain normalcy despite the day's unusual circumstances. Her choice of attire, jewelry, and personal presentation reflected an understanding that appearances would matter more tonight than usual. She was preparing to face whatever challenges awaited with the dignity and strength that had carried her through previous difficult periods. Margaret watched the Queen Consort make these preparations while processing the implications of the orders she had received. In her years of royal service, she had never been asked to physically prevent a senior family member from participating in household routines. The request crossed boundaries that she had never imagined would be tested, forcing her to confront fundamental questions about the nature of her duties and loyalties. The palace's evening routine typically included a gathering in the blue drawing room before dinner, where family members would share drinks and conversation about the day's events. It was one of the few times when the formal structure of royal protocol relaxed enough to allow genuine family interaction. Tonight, that routine would become a flashpoint for the tensions that had been building throughout the day. As 7 o'clock approached, Camilla completed her preparations and moved toward the door of her quarters with the composed confidence that had become her trademark in royal settings. Margaret positioned herself in accordance with normal security protocols, but her heart was racing as she realized that the next few minutes would require her to act in ways that contradicted everything she had learned about protecting and serving the royal family. The Queen Consort paused briefly to check her reflection in the antique mirror beside her door, making tiny adjustments to her hair and jewelry that spoke of a lifetime of experience in presenting herself perfectly for public observation. Margaret recognized these gestures as armor being donned for battle, preparation for facing challenges that required every possible advantage. Camilla's hand reached for the door handle with the natural confidence of someone moving through familiar territory toward expected routines. Margaret realized that this was the moment when she would have to transform from protector to obstacle, from enabler to enforcer. The weight of this transformation felt heavier than anything she had carried in her years of royal service. The Queen Consort opened her door and stepped into the corridor with a graceful bearing that had become second nature through years of royal duties. Her smile was warm but focused, prepared for whatever social navigation the evening might require. Margaret stepped forward, positioning herself in a way that blocked the natural path toward the family gathering areas. The moment of recognition passed between them in silence. Camilla understood immediately what Margaret's positioning meant, and Margaret could see the quick calculation of possibilities and responses that flashed across the Queen Consort's face. It was a moment of perfect communication without words, two women who had worked together long enough to understand each other's thoughts and motivations. Camilla's response demonstrated the wisdom gained through decades of navigating complex social and political situations. Rather than demanding explanations or expressing anger, she simply asked whether Margaret was acting under direct orders. The question was posed with quiet dignity that made it clear she understood the impossible position her protection officer was facing. Margaret's confirmation was delivered with professional restraint that barely concealed her personal distress about the situation. She explained that security protocols required modifications to the evening's routine and that these protocols were being implemented at the highest levels of authority. The language was diplomatic, but both women understood the reality it represented. The Queen Consort asked whether these restrictions were temporary or represented a permanent change in her status within the royal household. Margaret provided what reassurance she could while acknowledging that the duration of the current measures remained unclear. The conversation was conducted with mutual respect and understanding, but the underlying implications were devastating. Rather than attempt to challenge Margaret's authority or demand access to areas from which she was being excluded, Camilla made a decision that demonstrated both strength and strategy. She would respect the security protocols while requesting written clarification of their scope and duration through official channels. It was a response that maintained dignity while creating a formal record of the restrictions being imposed. Margaret experienced a profound sense of relief that the confrontation had been handled with such grace, but also deep sadness about the necessity of the confrontation itself. She realized that she was witnessing the fracturing of family relationships that had taken years to build, destroyed by institutional requirements that prioritized protocol over personal connections. The Queen Consort returned to her private quarters with composure that masked the emotional impact of being excluded from family gatherings for the first time since joining the royal household. Margaret remained on duty outside, knowing that her role had fundamentally changed from protection to confinement, from service to supervision. As the evening progressed, sound from other parts of the palace confirmed that the family dinner was proceeding without Camilla's participation. Margaret could hear the distant sounds of conversation and movement that spoke of normal social interaction continuing in spaces from which the Queen Consort was now excluded. The contrast between inclusion and isolation was stark and painful. Camilla spent the evening in her private sitting room, working on correspondence and reviewing briefing materials for upcoming engagements. Her focus and productivity were remarkable given the circumstances, but Margaret noticed the way she paused occasionally to listen to sounds from other parts of the palace, monitoring activities from which she was now excluded. The Queen Consort's dinner was served in her private quarters, a deviation from normal routine that was implemented without fanfare, but with implications that everyone understood. Margaret remained on duty throughout the meal, maintaining security protocols that felt more like imprisonment than protection. The role reversal was complete and deeply uncomfortable. As the evening moved toward its conclusion, Margaret received updates on activities elsewhere in the palace that confirmed the permanence of the changes being implemented. Communication protocols had been restructured, access codes had been permanently modified, and security arrangements had been established that would remain in effect indefinitely rather than temporarily. The realization that the day's events represented a permanent shift rather than a temporary crisis hit both women simultaneously. Camilla's question about the duration of the restrictions had been answered not through official channels, but through the practical arrangements that spoke of long-term rather than short-term planning. Margaret understood that her decision to comply with orders that excluded Camilla from family activities would define her relationship with the Queen Consort going forward. She had chosen institutional loyalty over personal connection, duty over compassion, and protocol over family solidarity. The choice had been necessary, but its personal cost was becoming apparent. The Queen Consort's response to this realization demonstrated the remarkable resilience that had carried her through previous challenges. Rather than expressing bitterness or demanding explanations that would not be provided, she began adapting to the new reality with practical efficiency that spoke of determination to maintain her dignity and effectiveness regardless of restrictions. As night settled over the palace, Margaret realized that the day's events had created a new structure of relationships within the royal household. Lines had been drawn, loyalties had been tested, and choices had been made that would influence the family dynamics for years to come. Her role in these changes had been instrumental, and she would carry the weight of that responsibility for the rest of her career. The silent standoff that had defined the day was concluding with quiet acceptance rather than dramatic confrontation. Both women had demonstrated grace under pressure, professionalism in difficult circumstances, and dignity in the face of choices that neither had wanted to make. The cost of institutional protection had been measured in personal relationships, and the price had been paid with remarkable courage by everyone involved. Margaret prepared for a future in which her role would require maintaining barriers between people who had previously operated as family, knowing that the success of her duties would be measured by how effectively she could enforce separation rather than enable connection. It was not the career she had envisioned when she first entered royal service, but it was the reality that circumstances had created.